the Vice President and Chief Program Officer of the UU Service Committee, where she leads the organization's creative and effective approaches to advancing human rights. Rachel is a human rights lawyer, a community organizer, and social justice advocate and educator with both domestic and international experience. She has a bachelor's degree with a focus in international development from George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs and a Doctor of Law from Vanderbilt. Prior to joining UUSC, Rachel's work included successful litigation against Exxon for violations of the Clean Air Act, and it included arguing for the right to seek asylum before the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and representing low-income immigrants and detained asylum seekers pursuing relief from unjust deportation in New York City. Her work with immigration particularly caught the eye of First Unitarian's Immigrant Justice Task Force, which is leading us this year as we grow in our immigration justice work. First Unitarian's been involved in immigration for some time. In addition to providing free ESL classes with childcare, volunteers from our congregation make it possible for First Congregational and the Quaker Meeting House to provide physical sanctuary for 2 people facing unjust deportation orders. We have members of our congregation who are trained in court accompaniment for immigrants, and our citizenship fund, which we established last year, has already helped at least 1 person attain U.S. citizenship. And this is important because when 1 person attains citizenship, it empowers her to help her family also get documentation to be in the U.S. That's always been known as the Family Reunification Program, and it's had bipartisan support in the past. Recently, the anti-immigrant camp has begun calling it chain migration in hopes of turning people against it with the negative connotations of the word chain. That's because family reunification is about family values, about caring about families, right? And it sounds as nice as it is, so they had to give it a name that wouldn't sound like what it is. It's a trick they're playing with public perception, but we know better. All of this work in support of immigrant families has earned First Unitarian the designation of Extended Sanctuary Church or Expanded Sanctuary Church. And I like that because it sounds like taking the spirit of this place, right, the spirit of these mornings, and extending it or expanding it out the doors of the church. And that is, in fact, what we're doing. The Immigrant Justice Task Force will have a table in the social hall after the service where you can get more info. And one of the things I'm glad Rachel is going to do this morning is she's going to help us see our work in its global context. We're so glad to have you here. Welcome, Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Angela, and thank you, everyone here, for inviting me to be a part of your community today. I am honored to be here with you and to be here with Carrie from the UUA, my dear friend and colleague, and to share the work of the UU Service Committee with you. This week has been a long one. I'll admit, I'm pretty happy to be here in the sun and in the warmth and not to be in the Boston snow. My husband is actually convinced that I choose my travel for work based on winter months and warm climates. He could be right. This week for me started with a 24-hour stomach bug, which then turned into being up all night with my 2-year-old, who found out that the next day that she had an ear infection. And then my 5-year-old had some sort of walking issue that then turned into a viral infection, which apparently is common for kids to pass to their knee joints. So this was all happening this week while we were stuck indoors for 2 days in a blizzard, hoping not to lose electricity. But, I find myself really needing to stop to appreciate and to find perspective in difficult moments. And I'm lucky right now because I'm here with you. I'm here in this beautiful area with these beautiful mountains and this clear sky. And I'm here, and even though it was cold this week in Boston, I still had heat. I still had electricity. I had access to water. I had an able-bodied spouse who was able to help shovel the snow. I had a roof that held up against the weight of the snow. I had 2 kids with casual sicknesses, with no dire emergency medicines. I had food in my cabinets, and most important, I had a community of loving neighbors who would help in a pinch and who would never ever judge my existence or my presence here. This week also came with other inevitable news developments that we've all been too comfortable with emanating out of Washington. As someone who studied law after 9/11, it's scary for me to think that a known torturer, Gene Haspel, could soon be leading the CIA. And I wonder sometimes, what do international relations students do in college today, as we learn that the State Department may or may not be there to fulfill U.S. commitments to uphold basic rights and the rule of law at home and abroad? But let's not go down that rabbit hole. I think that's best. We also know that this is the week that 3,000 schools and tens of thousands of students took part in a mass walkout on Wednesday, a remarkable response to the lack of political action that, like shootings before, followed the massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida last month. This week is about our youth. It's about our future. It's about our togetherness. It's about strong communities. And it's about deeper relationships with each other in this world based on love. So today I want to take some time to just pause together, to really reflect and to think about how we can move forward together as the need for our community and for our deep relationships and for upholding our values and the dignity of every human being, it has to be at the forefront of our minds. So I start this reflective exercise today together because I personally find it helpful that when I read the somewhat depressing global news, to stop myself and to remind myself of all the positive changes and all the stories of hope that are out there. As activist and author Naomi Klein said, politics hates a vacuum, and if it isn't filled with hope, someone else will fill it with fear. So let's spend the whole morning together to focus on the story of the human spirit, the story of powerful human rights actors, and the story of the never-ending movement for human rights. And while I'm going to tell you some more horrifying things today that you already know are happening around the world from the news, I'm going to share stories of hope, and ones that don't always make the front lines, but that come to us from UUSC's frontline partners. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to harness this moment together. And I'll be here afterwards for a little bit of time for lunch to bring back any of the stories that you want to share to UUSC staff as well. So my first story is more of a story about a congregation. It's a story of personal courage and a community just like yours coming together with compassion and persistence to change one person's stories. And it's a story that reminds me of this congregation, of this community, and what I've heard of it. It's also the story of how I found my way to the UU Service Committee. You see, I once worked for a civil rights firm in New York City, and the lead attorney humored my request to do pro bono work by connecting me to his UU congregation in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And it was there that I met 4 passionate UU women from the Ridgewood Social Justice Network. And these women chose to spend their free time visiting detained asylum seekers in the many large detention centers throughout New Jersey. And one of the cases sticks out most in my mind, and is the story of a woman named Betty Kennedy. And Betty was a Liberian refugee who escaped rebel forces during the reign of Charles Taylor, the former president and now convicted war criminal. And after witnessing her siblings' death by rebel forces, Betty had fled the country and come to the United States as a refugee. She had lived here about 7 years, just shy of her residency requirements to become a U.S. citizen, when a minor shoplifting incident landed her in detention, facing deportation. She had no representation. She suffered from severe PTSD. Her kids had been taken into Child Protective Services, and she lost her case because of basic procedural mishaps and because the immigration courts value expediency over justice. But Betty was resilient and determined. After all, what is the Department of Homeland Security when you faced rebel forces? The women in this detention center, they were a strong network of support. and they knew who to pull in for help. They knew that there were UU women visiting them. And that's the thing about hope. Once you have it, you can accomplish anything. And we see this in communities around the world who are constantly organizing for their own rights and their own self-determination. So my UU social justice friends began to visit Betty each week and to connect with her children's government representative and to help piece together the documents in her case. And next began a journey together, a 3-year process to win Betty's case. I wasn't always able to get out to New Jersey to deliver the documents or to do the visitation, but I came to depend on the generosity of this local congregation and their passionate commitment to help. Eventually, we found a psychologist that had treated Betty in the detention center. He testified about her PTSD, and we won the case. She was released, and she was reunited with her children after 4 years of being in a detention center. I share this story as a story about courage, but it's also a story of human kindness and about our interconnected work. And it's a story of hope where a few caring individuals offered their time and generosity to make a difference. And I share this story because I hear that these stories are happening locally. The accompanying work you are doing, the work of the Immigration Task Force and of individual members, it's making its way to Boston. We hear these stories all the time about what your community is doing, and we're proud to be affiliated with it. I see the values reflected throughout the UU congregations that I visit, and I'm inspired and I'm lucky to be part of this community. Which leads me to more stories. Since its founding, UUSC, our membership, like all of you, and our partners have sought to combat large-scale natural disasters, inequitable development, human rights abuses, and other forms of injustice. We believe that the antidote to these ills is to help empower local communities and NGOs to catalyze vibrant and democratic social movements. Unfortunately, given today's political context, Betty's case might surely become a tragic statistic in an immigration enforcement report, where a criminal alien was deported because of their conviction. ICE, to me, is really changing their mandate. I sometimes wonder, should they be called the Infliction of Cruelty Enforcement Agency instead? Their mandate continues to shift, and it seems to be that they're hell-bent on tearing up families. Do you remember when they were just an agency for customs and passport processing? I had a run-in with ICE myself. I was 3 years old when I came to this country. My mother's from Malaysia, and she could not carry a visa on her passport, given that she was a woman, and Malaysia's patriarchal, regressive laws at the time prevented this. So our visas were on our father's passport. But my father came to the US as an H-1B skilled scientist visa. So as soon as we arrived at customs, they gave my dad a hard time, and they said, well, we can't come into the country as H-1B skilled scientists. After all, I was 3. So my dad looked at the agent and he said, well, you know what? I have to report to work next day. So he handed him our passports, our bags, and the number for my grandparents in England. Well, the agent took one look at us, my brother and I, 3 and 5 at the time, whining for food, and he quickly backed down from his position. But I continue to wonder about that story and what would happen in today's environment. And I wonder, what would happen if we hadn't come from England? Or what would happen if our father wasn't white? Today, ICE's shift in power is one of the most alarming signs of authoritarianism and one of the biggest threats to our democracy. I keep thinking, is it not time to defund them? Unfortunately, being seen as a danger rather than someone who is facing danger, being criminalized and then denied basic support, this isn't unique to this administration, nor is to this country. These examples can be seen throughout history and throughout the world. In Burma, for example, power is divided between a military regime with a long and bloody history of human rights violations and a nominally civilian government that is unwilling to speak out against the military's actions for fear of losing its tenuous hold on the state. As a result, persecution is again breaking out against the ethnic Rohingya people, a stateless Muslim minority who have been denied citizenship in their home country and confined to camps. UUSC partners are providing critical life-saving support to the roughly 650,000 Rohingya people who have arrived in Bangladesh fleeing the violence this summer. And our partners are documenting the crimes on the ground and advocating for justice and accountability at the UN and other international institutions. And despite our own federal government's dysfunction in other areas, UUSC was able to work in collaboration with an international coalition to secure U.S. economic sanctions on the main military generals starting some of this. But the violence still continues at the hands of others. In Alaska and the South Pacific, indigenous communities are suffering from a different type of displacement as climate change drives from their homes a metaphorical, slow-moving tsunami. This summer, UUSC staff members stood in the islands of the South Pacific, meeting with indigenous communities who were struggling to convince international agencies of the reality of climate change-induced displacement, even as many of those people had been forced to relocate from their ancestral homelands and to have to plan for irrevocable changes of life. And by the way, I don't know if you've heard, Rex Tillerson said, you know what, we don't need to worry about climate change because humans are so adaptable. Well, I have a news flash, Rex. Humans can adapt, and they often do this when their land becomes unproductive from drought or flooding or catastrophic storms. Yes, they do this by moving and by leaving their home. And sometimes this happens across borders. Yes, Mr. Tillerson, humans can adapt, and they will, quite possibly in your backyard. We see this in Central America, where severe drought and violence with impunity are pushing families from fleeing the Northern Triangle up to our borders. These are people searching for freedom from violence and just the most basic human rights. In the United States, we see humans adapting once again. Severe flooding took over the streets of Houston, rapidly displacing people from their homes. UUSC, with the help of the UUA, responded by supporting community partners, working to draw media attention to the real lives impacted by the storm, empowering communities to lift their voices up, and continuing a public call for inclusive and equitable recovery efforts that help all. These communities are particularly at great risk due to the outsized influence of industrial corporations in the area who have captured the local economy there. All of these injustices, they can seem disparate and far removed from one another, but in fact, they are deeply intertwined. The Rohingya refugees of Myanmar are connected to their refugee siblings in the Americas and to the people displaced by climate change. They are suffering the consequences of mindsets and policies that write off entire groups of at-risk people as not my problem, or that stigmatize whole communities. And when President Trump and his colleagues, by their actions, what they do is they contribute to a world where governments think they can violate the rights of others with impunity. When we begin to appreciate the connections between all of these injustices, it can seem overwhelming, and we may feel too small to do anything about it. The truth is, no one designed this complex, and no one person controls it, and it only takes small acts of resistance, courage, and hope to defeat this. And then it takes stories to infect the minds of people across the political spectrum, stories that learn from the past, that place us in the future, and that guide us forward. At UUSC, we're lucky to hear these stories, and we get to work with some of those most remarkable human rights activists from around the world. These are people who wake up each day not sure of what their efforts might bring for their communities, but who continue on anyways because of their deep hope and belief in love and equality and humanity. These are communities that have had to work outside of and around power structures, knowing that their public institutions were oppressive. In fact, I just had the great privilege of meeting a UUSC partner down with the College of Social Justice in Nicaragua. We were there with the women's organizing movement partner, and with the Guardians of the Yohuska River community that just defeated a major Canadian gold mining company. Each day, I get to draw strength from the stories of our partners who know that change is possible. And after all, human rights have progressed over history, and human rights movements have been defying colonialist and authoritarian oppression for decades. Human rights movements have disrupted entrenched systems of economic, political, social, cultural, and racial oppression. And the fight for humans to own their own self-determination, well, that's at the heart of everything we do in collaboration with our community partners. And the struggle for human rights is very often a fight not for the present, but for the future, and for one's children and their children. And that's why we, as in all of us here today, must join hands together to make this change in the world together. The capacity of community-driven local efforts to together build large-scale systemic change, this is the heart of our work. This can be seen in UUSC partners leveraging small amounts of resources and tiny staff sizes to support asylum seekers and migrants in U.S. detention centers, to support their legal rights and to push for policy change. It was visible in the partners supporting migration with dignity and community advocacy for people displaced by climate change, or in the youth building long-lasting connections between their home islands and the islands of where they are moving. And it was visible in the partners I visited in Burma, training for a new generation of peace builders and change makers that could shake up the status quo on the ground. Civil rights activist Valerie Carr said recently, well, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but what if this is the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one of long labor? What if our grandfathers and our grandparents are standing behind us now, whispering to us, "You are brave"? What if this is our nation's great tradition? What does the midwife tell us to do? Breathe and to push. To think, tonight we have to breathe and tomorrow we have to labor. So I think we just need to do just that. And as our Justice GA speaker this past summer, Brian Stevenson, reminded us, we need to get proximate. That is, closer to the issues we are trying to address and the true people we are trying to empower in order to be social change agents ourselves. Part of our joint UUA and UUSC Love Resists work is about resisting criminalization in the United States and in our communities and creating sanctuary for people being unjustly targeted because of their identity. It's about growing relationships of solidarity between those who are being targeted because of their identities and those who identify as their allies. And we've learned that our solidarity is most effective when we listen to and make central the leadership, insights, and experiences of people who are most threatened by the history of injustice and the current political climate. So some of these issues today may seem more pressing and more relevant here in your community, and some may seem very far away and remote. But being part of a human rights movement is one way to deepen our commitment to democracy and to understand how all of these global forces are connected. And you can join this great struggle too and become UUSC members or congregational liaisons to go deeper with us in this work and to identify areas for your congregation to be in collaboration with UUSC. We can take action together, as we did recently, to influence our government's foreign policy in Burma, or with one of our many campaigns, such as the Love Resists work. Your congregation was once at 25% membership, but it has gone down to 17%. So I hope that you'll visit us afterwards in the hall and consider a $40 donation to become a member today. Or you might consider a $125 gift, which will be matched by the UU congregation at Shelter Rock and doubled to a $250 donation. Together, and there's so much more you can do if you go to UUSC's website and you follow up many of the ways that you can take action with us and with our frontline community partners. Together, we can show up and we can take a stand together or engage in actions of nonviolence and to raise our voice. And we promise that we'll do our best to be in partnership with you and to help you connect to frontline communities around the world. I want to thank you all again for being part of UUSC's journey towards a more just and loving world. And I wish you all a courageous and hopeful year. Thank you very much.
So today we have the opportunity to make a special offering in addition to the regular collection, in which all coins will go to the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. You'll find a special envelope enclosed in your order of service. Using this envelope, you're invited to make a separate contribution to the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee to advance human rights around the world. Gifts can be made with cash, checks, or credit cards, or you can go to uusc.org to give online. And as Rachel mentioned, a $40 gift makes you a member of the UUSC, and if you're lucky enough to make a $125 gift or more, it'll be doubled through the Shelter Rock congregation in New York. All gifts can be placed in the offering baskets, or if you need a little more time, you can drop them off in the office after the service. Today, together, we extend the reach and the impact of our values in the wider world. Thank you for your generosity.
I'd like to give a translation for our next piece, which is Ukutula. Peace in this world of sin. The love of Jesus brings peace, redemption, faith, victory, and comfort.